Okay, right on to the main program. It's a great honor for me to introduce our first keynote speaker this morning, Danielle Bassett. As you've perhaps noticed, network science applications have been growing tremendously in the area of neuroscience. The neuroscience satellite yesterday was very well attended. Dani has been a leader in this field for a number of years now. She received her degree in physics, undergraduate degree from Penn State, and a graduate PhD from University of Cambridge. She has gone on to do postdocs at UCSB and then has been faculty at Penn for the past 3 or 4 years. She's been extraordinarily accomplished in her field, has won numerous awards, too many to list them all here. A very prestigious Sloan Fellowship and the MacArthur Fellowship in 2014. Her work is a blend of network science, fundamental research applied to brain networks across the board, from structural brain networks in the brain to functional connectivity, control theory and engineering, major ingredients in her research. Her work has been expanding the horizons of network science outward and into a very fertile area where the intersection of network science and neuroscience is giving rise to very exciting research these days. I'm very pleased to introduce Dani, so please give her a round of applause. Dani, come on up here.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak with you today. So the title of my talk is The Network Origins, Organ, and Object of Learning. But before I actually dig into the details of learning that I want to get across to you today, I wanted to just tell you a little bit of background. So as Olaf mentioned, I'm trained as a physicist. So some of the work that I do is actually trying to understand networks in granular media, particularly how particles interact with one another and put pressure on one another. So we study force networks, specifically, and force chains in granular media. We use them to try to understand acoustic transmission through granular media, and we also use them to try to understand how granular media reconfigure under compression. So an illustration on the bottom of this slide is when you take granular media, you compress two of the walls, you can see a reconfiguration of the communities inside of the force network. So that is a sort of an illustration of some of the themes that have actually crossed over into my neuroscience work, which is how do networks actually reconfigure under external drivers? And so brains are a very specific and very exciting case in which their networks actually do change under external drivers. Just to describe exactly how the brain is a network, and I'm going to describe this in a little bit more detail in the next coming slides, but the brain can be naturally represented in a way that regions inside of the brain will be nodes inside of our network, and then the edges inside of this network will either be structural connections, so neuronal axons or bundles of neuronal axons, or they'll be functional connections, so similarities in patterns of regional activity. So this system, actually, both of these types of networks reconfigure under different pressures. The structural network on the left-hand side of this slide reconfigures under evolution, so you can watch across species and see the changes in the network structure that have accompanied evolutionary pressures. It also changes with development as kids grow from young children up through adults. It also changes under trauma and under experience. So they're very important ways in which these networks actually reconfigure. On the right-hand side, the functional connectivity patterns in the brain also reconfigure, again, in different cognitive states, in development, following experience, and during learning. So we've been trying to study these reconfiguration patterns over the last several years. One of the particular domains that I'm interested in understanding these reconfiguration patterns is in the acquisition of new motor skills. So for example, imagine this little kid who's learning how to ride a tricycle. So this child has the patterns inside of their brain have to change in many different ways in order for them to learn this particular skill. So there are 3 different types of networks that can change inside of their head as they're learning. The one that I've listed on the bottom is underlying structure. So the actual patterns of hard wires inside of the brain can change as they are learning a skill like this. In the middle, an interesting question is, what about baseline dynamics? So when this child is resting, not actually on the tricycle, but just resting, their sort of normal idling mode of activity. How do the patterns of connectivity in that particular case impact on how well they'll learn when they're actually asked to do something? And then the top one is, how do the network dynamics that occur during the actual learning relate to their adaptive behavior? So these are three different ways in which the network organization can change, and they may either occur, they all occur on top of one another, and they may sort of drive each other. There may be feedback between these different network layers, and in fact, what I will sort of mention in a couple minutes is that I think we really need multi-layer models to understand how each of these networks interact with one another to enable learning to occur. But to sort of study each of these separately, what we can do is, we can't actually put a child on a tricycle inside of an MRI scanner, which is one of the normal ways of imaging a brain. And the reason is that the scanner is composed of a very large magnet, and so you can't put metal near it. But what you can do is actually have individuals inside of the scanner learn something a little bit like Guitar Hero. So up here on the top left, what you see is what somebody would see inside of the scanner. So they'll see a pseudo-musical staff, and then on that pseudo-musical staff, they'll see these notes, and this will indicate to them which buttons they need to press. And they'll be learning a sequence of finger movements instead of moving their legs to ride the tricycle. So this says press the purple button, then the blue button, then the green button, and then the red button, etc. So individuals will practice this type of sequence over the course of days or even weeks. And in the data that I'm about to show you, individuals practice 6 different sequences for 6 weeks. And they practice half an hour a day. And what we did is that we actually noticed that the amount of time that it took them to play one of these sequences changed fairly drastically over that time period. So the common curve of the length of time that it takes individuals is an exponential. So in this particular case, it might start off at about 5 seconds to play one of these little sequences, and then at the end of 6 weeks, it may take more like about a half of a second. So the big question that we have is, what happens in the brain while behavior is changing? So notice that this is an organism, a human, who is changing their behavior, and that change in behavior requires a change in the networks inside of your head that are driving that behavior, right? So how do we study that? Well, we study that by having individuals do all of this training, or most of the training, inside of the scanner, and we take an image of their brain every 2 seconds. Every 2 seconds, we map out which regions of the brain have high activity, which regions of the brain have low activity. Then what we do is that we take that data and we separate it out into individual time windows, which I'm illustrating here on the right-hand side of the graph. And in each time window, we estimate patterns of functional connectivity, or a functional network. So what this means is that different regions of the brain are connected up by a strength in how similar the time series are in those 2 regions. And we usually use a measure of magnitude squared coherence as an estimate of how similar the time series are. So by doing this, we can have a whole string of networks in a row that quantifies the reconfiguration patterns that accompany learning. So then what sorts of methods do we apply to try to understand that reconfiguration? One of the most powerful techniques that we have found to understand these reconfigurations is actually dynamic community detection. And the reason that we think that that is particularly relevant here is that community structure in the brain is very salient. It's present across young kids, older individuals, aging individuals. It's present in health and disease. It's present across different cognitive states. It's identified across every lab that acquires data. It's really one of the most robust findings characteristic of the mesoscale architecture in these networks. So what we've been doing is saying, well, if that's the most salient mesoscale organization, then how does that actually change as individuals are learning? So we've been using a multilayer modularity equality function based on Peter Muka's and his colleagues' work in 2010. We maximize this multilayer modularity equality function subject to a partition, and to give us the partition of nodes into communities as a function of time. Importantly, we've done a lot of work over the last couple of years to identify which particular null models we should be using. So this PIJL is the requisite null model for the comparison to the given adjacency matrix. And we've done a lot of work to try to determine exactly what sort of null model makes sense for a brain. We've also done a lot of work in trying to understand which resolution parameters we should be using, and both on the spatial scales and on the temporal scales, to really observe the salient organization in this system. I will mention that while the data that I'm about to show you is based on this maximization of the multilayer modularity equality function, we also have some work extending these ideas into stochastic block models to try to understand potentially more complex organizations in the connectivity. And we've also been trying to understand relationships between patterns of connectivity and patterns of activation. And for that, we've been using annotated graphs, and particularly community detection on annotated graphs. We have also finally been doing a little bit of work in trying to build very simple models of how these networks are reconfiguring. We've started with a pairwise maximum entropy model because that sort of is one of the perhaps simplest ways that you could imagine modeling this reconfiguration, but we're extending that as well. Okay, but let's focus on modularity for the moment. So what we observe in these brain images while people are playing is a couple things. I want you to all focus on the left-hand side of this slide. And I'm showing you here, each of these matrices is actually a module allegiance matrix. So it's an n by n matrix where the value of each element gives the probability that those two nodes are present in the same module. And what you observe is that there's very strong block diagonal structure. And these blocks actually correspond with the motor cortex, that's one block, and the visual cortex, which is the other block. Oops. And what you can see is that at 0 weeks, we have, you can see the two blocks, but you can also see strong integration between the two blocks. So you see the more greener colors on the off diagonal. And then as we go to 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and 6 weeks, you can see that those colors become darker blue, which indicates a growing autonomy of those two modules inside of the network. And that's just a visual for you. The actual statistics are down here at the bottom. So this is the motor visual integration, which is the average value in these off diagonal blocks. And you can see that that decreases drastically with the number of trials practiced. So what this indicates is that motor visual connectivity actually tracks the changes in adaptive behavior in the individuals. The second really salient structure that we observed is that there's a top-down control mechanism inside of the brain from frontal areas, so areas in the front of the brain here. And what happens to those while people are learning is that those regions actually release from the rest of the network as people are learning. And so that's what you're seeing on the bottom here. So this is the release of this this frontal sort of top-down control mechanism. So these are the two phenotypes that you observed. One is that the modules separate from one another, motor and visual systems, and then there's a release of this frontal cortex. What does that actually mean? So let me give you a little bit of intuition for why that's important. Why that's important is that as people are practicing, they're able to play these little finger movements without even really thinking about the visual information in front of them. So there's a almost complete disconnect between what they see and what they can play. You can think about when you're running or playing soccer or anything else, you're very rarely thinking exactly about which movements you want to make, right? And that's something that occurs and enables you to first of all, not think too hard, but also be able to watch your surroundings and not necessarily have conflict between your visual information and the motor information. The release of the frontal parietal circuitry enables you to just sort of push all of this down into motor memory and again, not think too much about it. So that's what happens during the task. Then the next question we had was, well, that's nice. Now we can sort of understand who is not just the phenotypes of the changes in the network as people are learning, but we can also say who's learning better and who's learning worse, depending on which of these phenotypes we see stronger in those individuals. But the next question is, could I have put people into the scanner for 5 minutes and taken a very quick couple pictures of the brain and been able to say, over the next 6 weeks, you're going to be a great learner or you're going to be a really terrible learner, right? That would be really interesting. And why that would be really interesting is that there are many cases in which we'd like to understand what the prognosis of somebody is in learning. And if it's going to be poor, then potentially we can intervene. Think about somebody who has just had a stroke. they may need to do a lot of motor therapy right after the stroke, and we'd like to know right away if that's something that's going to progress in a quick manner, or if it's a person who really needs much more additional physical therapy to bring them up to speed at the right level. So what we did is that we had these same individuals. We took a 5-minute scan before they started training for 6 weeks, and we asked, from that 5-minute scan, can we predict what's going to happen? And the answer is yes, which is really mind-blowing to me. So here what we have is the learning rate of these 20 individuals over that 6 weeks of training, and on the x-axis here is the connectivity between the visual and motor modules inside of this network in that 5-minute scan before they started training. And what you can see is that people who have less visual motor connectivity learn much better in the following 6 weeks, and people who have higher visual connectivity learn much worse over the next 6 weeks. So this is importantly a network predictor of future learning, which I think is really exciting. And this is mostly driven by regions in the colchicum and sulcus, which is in the visual cortex, and the superior precentral area, which is in motor cortex. So what does, if we had to write down a sort of simple model of that, I think what that means is that people who have more disconnected modules initially are actually much more flexible while they're learning, whereas if those modules are much more connected at the beginning, they are potentially, their dynamics may be more constrained and therefore less adaptable. Okay, so the last question is, what could we have identified all of this just from a structural scan, right? So what I've shown you all so far is that these networks that I'm studying are where the edges are defined by similarities in activity, right? But those similarities in activity have to occur on top of a hardwired structural network that sits inside of your brain. And up here on the right-hand side is what one of those structural networks looks like. We can take that type of image from any individuals, again, using an MRI scanner. This is called diffusion imaging. It maps out the propagation or diffusion of water molecules inside of the brain, and from that you can deduce these structural wires. So what we did is that we asked, from that structural picture, could we identify who was going to learn well and who was not going to learn well? And again, the answer is yes. So on the left-hand side, we see that individuals who have stronger connectivity inside of their visual module tend to learn better. Connectivity inside of motor module does not really change anything. And that seems to be specific to intra-hemispheric connections rather than inter-hemispheric connections. So you have two hemispheres inside of your brain, and so one interesting question is, does this learning depend on connectivity between the hemispheres, or does it mostly just depend on connectivity inside of a single hemisphere? And the answer in this particular case is that it seems to depend on connectivity inside of a hemisphere, and specifically inside of the visual cortex. But we also noticed that while the connectivity between motor and visual modules was not predictive of learning in this structural case, that's mostly because there are actually no or very few direct connections between your motor cortex and your visual cortex in the underlying structure. So there's not a direct connection, but there are longer distance paths. So if you actually look at the matrix and take powers of the matrix to look at higher length walks inside of this network, then you actually realize that the longer walks between motor and visual cortex are predictive of how well somebody is going to learn. So the stronger those long distance walks, the better somebody is going to learn. Okay, so those were 3 data slides, so I want to condense all of that down into a simple model of how this seems to work in this case. So what characterizes a good learner? Here's the summary of these last few slides. What characterizes a good learner is that you have the motor module, you have the visual module. In terms of underlying structural network organization, you have an integration between these 2 areas, and that's predictive of better learning. Their baseline dynamics, you actually have independence being predictive of learning. And then during the actual task, when you're asking the network to perform, the growing autonomy between these 2 modules is predictive of learning. Simultaneously, we have this release of this top-down control system. So I think that's really, I think it's important, but it's also complicated. Hopefully your minds are struggling with that tension that in terms of the structure, these 2 regions are the more connected these modules are, the better. But in terms of baseline dynamics, the more independent, the better. And that's a little bit of a quandary. So right now what we're asking is, to really understand this, I think that we need to be building multi-layer models that combine these three different sorts of networks together with one another and understand and test a little bit more about which is actually driving which. So that's the next step in that series. The next question that we have is, when we understand that simple circuit, then how do we intervene to help somebody to learn better, right? So again, think about somebody who has just had a stroke and needs to have motor therapy afterward. We now understand a little bit more about the network phenotypes that are characterizing good versus bad motor learning. So now that we understand that a bit more, could we intervene? Could we use that knowledge about the network to intervene to make it better? So what we've been doing over the last couple of years is to think about what it means to control a brain network. And that, to me, is how do I intervene in the brain network to push it towards a better state that's more conducive to learning. So the first couple studies that we did focused on assessing control strategies related to specifically cognitive control, so this top-down controller that I told you about. We've also been comparing control in brain graphs to those in random graphs. We've also been extending simple linear models of control to modeling nonlinear dynamics in the brain as well. And so that's this Muldoon et al. Paper. More recently, we've been asking how those control strategies change as children grow, because that's particularly important if you're thinking about intervening across the age range. We've also been thinking about control strategies at rest, and after traumatic brain injury. And we have a couple reviews down here at the bottom if you're curious about sort of where brain network control is right now as a developing field. Okay. But the next thing I wanted to do was to ask what other sorts of learning might be particularly important for the human condition. When I say learning, you probably weren't thinking motor skill learning. You were probably thinking learning math or learning language or learning many other things. When I think about learning, I often think about learning the values of things. So learning the value of cultures and communities, learning the value of money, learning the value of knowledge. So very consistently over many of the things that we learn, a lot of it is driven by how well we can learn the value of things and learn that value from other individuals in our communities. So how do we learn value? And what are the network phenotypes of learning value inside of the brain? So this is kind of fun. So what we did is that we showed people 12 different really nebulous looking objects up here at the top. And each of them had a different value, monetary value associated with it. What we did is that we showed people 2 different objects, and then we asked them which one is more valuable, and they would press one or the other, and then we would either say, yes, that was more valuable by giving it a green box, or we would actually tell them the exact monetary value. So this is sort of absolute information about the value, and this is relative information about the value. And so over the course of 4 days and about 1,600 trials, people learned the value of these 12 nebulous objects. Okay. Here is the actual curve of accuracy over time. So here is the percent correct as a function of the number of trials practiced. So you can see they started out about 60%. And then by the end of these 4 days of training inside the scanner, they were up to about 95% on average. Okay, so what is happening in the brain as people are learning these values? Okay, well, what's happening in the brain is that, again, we see that there's very strong modular structure. The modular structure is a little bit different than the one that we saw in motor learning. Here on the left-hand side is the consensus community structure from all of the information collected in all little time windows of networks over all subjects over 4 days. And so you can see really nice roughly spatially localized modules, except for this one in the frontal cortex in blue, which spans to the back of the brain as well in this frontal parietal circuitry that's actually very well known for control, top-down control of behavior. Then what we observed is that there were regions of the brain, or there were modules that are very consistently present over the entire time period, and then others that are less consistently present. The ones that were most consistently present, and therefore were least flexible, so on here, the x-axis is the flexibility of these modules, and here is the variance of learning explained. You can see the ones that were least flexible explain the most amount of learning, and the ones that were most flexible explain the least amount about learning. So what that suggests to us is that, similar to the motor learning case, we actually have the fact that there are very strong modules, and changes in those very strong and consistent modules are the phenotypes that best describe learning, whereas changes in this periphery of sort of very changeable, transiently changing modular structure are less predictive of learning. In this study, we also used machine learning methods to predict a person's learning stage directly from their brain network structure. So we just looked at the brain network and said, with 93.75% accuracy, what learning stage they were in out of those 4 days. So that's exciting to me, I think. So how do we put those two pieces together to understand, are there complementary network mechanisms of learning or distinct network mechanisms of learning? And I think the answer is that there's both. In both of these sets of studies, what we find is that there's this set of very strong modules that are consistently expressed over time, and it's changes in their structure that predicts learning. On the motor learning side, it's actually an autonomy between the motor and the visual systems that's predictive of learning, enabling you to push all of these skills down into motor memory so that you can leave your eyes free to do other things. In value learning, it's actually an integration between their two modules that are relevant. So why is that the case? The two modules that are relevant in value learning is a module in the back of the brain that's important for object recognition, so figuring out which of those nebulous little shapes I'm looking at. And then the second module is one in frontal cortex that helps me to assess value of something. So it's actually integration between your object regions and your value regions that help you to learn the value of objects. Maybe that was obvious, but it's nice to actually see it in the data. So that suggests to me that changes in this temporal core structure are consistent across these two kinds of learning, but one requires a growing autonomy and the other one requires a growing dependence. Okay, but I want to say that movements are unitary. So yes, we can learn single movements. Yes, we can learn single values. But humans actually learn really complex patterns of relational data. And none of these studies that I just showed you really address the fact that we learn really complex patterns of relational data. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing you a knowledge network. So different concepts are connected to one another by relationships. Language is obviously a network. Different phonemes tend to be connected or located near one another in different sorts of languages with different sorts of rules. And written text is a network as well. Words tend to be written close to one another when they have similar semantic content, and farther away from one another when they have different semantic content. And these are the kinds of things that we learn. When you think about a kid in a classroom, this is what they're learning. They're not necessarily learning running. They're learning something more like this. So how can we understand how people learn complex relational patterns? Really, how do they learn networks, right? So my little thought experiment to myself was, let's suppose I have to lecture in a class at Penn with a bunch of undergraduates in the room. I have 15 different ideas that I want to translate to these undergraduates. Here are my 15 ideas. I know that those 15 ideas are actually related to one another. They're not independent concepts, they're related concepts, and they have a very particular pattern of relationships between them. In this case, there are 5 concepts that are strongly interrelated, another 5 that are interrelated, another 5 that are interrelated, and those 3 groups are connected in a cycle, right? So this is just an example of one kind of relational pattern that I might want to transmit in a lecture. The big challenge to somebody who's lecturing is that I have this complicated idea in my head, an actual network space of concepts, but I need to transmit it in one dimension because I have to transmit it in time, right? So I'm only allowed to speak one word after the other. Sometimes I try to speak more than one at the same time, but usually you have to, obey the rules of one word at a time, which means that I need to transmit this in a line. How do I do that? It's a really neat mapping problem, right? Okay, and particularly how do I do it in such a way that maximizes the learning of that complex shape? So what we can do is actually say, well, I'm going to take all of these concepts. I'm actually going to, instead of concepts, because that's a little bit harder, I'm going to first say that these are fractal pictures. And each of these fractals I'm going to show to individuals in a line that is defined by a random walk on top of this network, right? So now I'm going to see a series of fractal images that's defined by a random walk on that network that I have specified. The people who are watching have no idea that there's this underlying network structure, and the question is, do they actually learn it implicitly by the pattern of the walk? So what we do is that we show them this is an actual experiment on Amazon Mechanical Turk with real live human beings trying to learn these patterns. And we do this for about 35 minutes, 1.5 seconds per image. And the task that we ask people to do is to detect whether the image is rotated or not. They have to press 1 for rotated, press 2 for not rotated. All right, and the question that we had was, does it depend on what type of walk I use to show this network? So on the left-hand side, maybe I'm going to show them a random walk on the network. I could show them a Hamiltonian walk on the network, or I could show them an Eulerian walk on the network. So the Hamiltonian walk is one where I'm going to pass through each of the nodes at least once before passing through one again. And the Eulerian walk is going to be where I'm going to pass through every edge on the network before passing that same edge again. And the big question is, which of these three walks enables people to learn this network better? So here's the data. What we observed is that, remember I told you their cover task was that they had to determine if these images were rotated or not. We realized that individuals were much slower at determining rotations when they move from one cluster to another cluster. So as they're moving from this yellow cluster to this one, they slow down, and it takes them longer to figure out that that image was rotated. So on the right-hand side here, I'm plotting the reaction time difference across that cluster transition as a function of the three different walks. So Eulerian first, Hamiltonian second, and then random last. What you see is that their surprise at the transition is very salient for both the Eulerian walk and for the random walk. It's not very present for the Hamiltonian walk. So how do we relate that to learning? Well, the more surprised they are at the transition, I think the more they're realizing that there's clustered structure in this data, right? So more surprise, or the slower the reaction time at the transition, is actually an indication that they're learning the underlying structure. So this suggests to us that maybe I should give my lectures using either an Eulerian walk through my ideas or a random walk. We'll ask the students which they prefer later. Okay. But this is actually, I think, a more general paradigm for understanding how people learn network patterns of all sorts, right? So then we thought, well, what's another kind of network pattern that people learn a lot? We learn social networks often. And maybe that's not something that you've thought about a lot, but you walk into a bar, you walk into a class, you walk into a new dorm, you walk into a new workplace, you walk into a meeting, you very quickly determine what the social network structure is in the people around you, and you figure that out so that you can better interact with that network structure, right? And people who are good at figuring out that network structure quickly tend to be better at many sorts of careers than individuals who can't learn that network structure very quickly, right? So we thought, well, how could we actually measure something like that experimentally? So what we did is that we used the exact same test built on this graph here. And now all that we did was that we told the participants that each of these fractals is actually an online avatar for a real person. So all of the stimuli are exactly the same. So that means that we can directly compare data from one to the other. But now people are associating a person with each of these little visual images. And what you can see is that, at least in preliminary data, we have that the amount of learning is actually lower for the non-social case, where they did not think these images were avatars. And then it's better for the social case, where they did think that these images were avatars. So that suggests that social information could actually be modulating the degree of learning that actually happens in these individuals. Now, importantly, this differs across people. So on the right-hand side, what I'm showing you is that we had each of the participants also take several personality tests. And one of them was to what degree they sort of associated their ideals with more of an individualistic cultural values or more collectivistic cultural values. And what you observe is that there's a strong negative correlation between their scoring on individualism versus collectivism and the surprisal effect, which is that the amount of learning that occurred on this graph. And particularly individuals with more collectivistic cultural values had greater learning of the graphs than individuals who had more individualistic cultural values. So I think that indicates that if you have collectivistic cultural values, you're more aware, you're thinking constantly about what the social structure is, you care about it, you want to fit into it, you want to support it, and that actually enables you to learn social networks better. And that's exactly what we are seeing on the right-hand side here. So I think that that's really interesting. We're currently writing that up, so that's not on arXiv yet, but hopefully will be soon. Okay, but that I think brings me to a bigger picture point, which is that I think it's time to bridge brain networks and social networks. So specifically, a lot of the work that we've been doing is on understanding network architecture in the brain, network dynamics in the brain, and there's also been this amazing work separately in understanding social networks and their dynamics and their structure, and I think it may be time to try to understand how these two relate to each other. So some specific questions are, to what extent do social network dynamics cause changes in a person's brain? So where you are sitting in your social network, does it change the way that your brain responds? And simultaneously, does the way that your brain actually, the way that it's constructed, does that potentially inform where you end up being placed in your social network, right? And then to what extent, more generally, can understanding and integrating the study of social and brain networks dynamics advance an understanding of, number one, basic psychological principles, but also aid in deriving fundamental principles about the organization of society? So just to make this a teeny bit more concrete, I wanted to show you one study that we have just recently done in collaboration with Emily Falk's group at the University of Pennsylvania in the Annenberg School of Communication that does actually link brain networks and social networks. So here what we did is that we had individuals play the cyberball game. I don't know if any of you are familiar with cyberball, but basically you put individuals inside of a scanner, you give them a ball virtually in this little game, and then they're allowed to throw the ball to other people. And they don't actually realize that what ends up happening is that they can throw the ball for a little while, but eventually the two people that they're playing with just throw back and forth to each other and no longer throw to you in the scanner. And you end up feeling very socially excluded, can actually make people cry. So it's a very, it can be really socially painful. And so what we did is that we tried to understand what are the changes in the brain that can accompany this social exclusion. We found that during social exclusion, there was a heightened connectivity inside of a subnetwork of the brain that's called the mentalizing system. And that's the system that enables you to think about the perspectives of others. And so connectivity inside of that little system changes drastically during the exclusion setting, as opposed to the inclusion, when they are actually passing the ball to the person in the scanner as well. And on the right-hand side, what you see is the connectivity change in one of these regions of the mentalizing system as a function of the density of the friendship network as measured by the Facebook API with data collected from 2011 to 2013. So specifically, we're looking at the entire friendship network of an individual. We take the individual out and all of its connections, and we just look at how many connections are present between that person's friends, and divided by the number of possible connections. So that's the density of the friendship network that we're studying. And you can see a negative correlation. What this suggests is that there's actually less connectivity change when your friendship network is high density, potentially indicating that there are social network resources that can alter how your brain responds to excluding experiences. And this is just an illustration of a first step in the direction of connecting up these two kinds of data with one another. So that brings me to, if it's a first step, what's the next step, right? Well, the next step is that I think we need to build a brain-social multilayer network to really understand causal drivers of relationships between the brain and social networks, and then social networks to the brain. So specifically, I talked to you about several different kinds of brain networks. We already need to be developing multilayer models for just brain. But then as we go from brain, we're to people, there are specific brain network states that can be linked to ideas, beliefs, and behaviors. There's also some really beautiful work in linking two brains with one another, depending on how synchronized their dynamics are. So if you take images of two people at the same time, you can actually ask how synchronized are the dynamics between those two brains. And you can have explicit quantifiable links between two brains, or many brains, depending on how many you're actually measuring at the same time. And then among individuals, of course, there's then the idea of idea and behavior spread through the social network, either through contagion or perhaps through reinforcement learning. So I started the talk by learning. I do think that we learn a lot of behaviors from our social network, and that actually potentially studying the learning of new behaviors in the brain all the way through to the social networks is a tractable place to start, because we're starting to understand the brain phenotypes. We understand a little bit about how that works in social networks, and potentially we could bridge the two. Okay, with that, I'd like to acknowledge the people who were important in the work that I showed you. So of course the entire group, but specifically these individuals whose studies I showed you explicitly, the faculty collaborators who were extremely important in this work. I wanted to put a particular call out to several past trainees who now have faculty positions in various places around the world, and obviously also to the funding agencies that supported and continue to support this work. Thank you very much for listening. I would love to answer questions.
When you mentioned the connectivity between different human brains in a social interaction, is that like mirror neural activity?
Mirror neurons can be involved, but they're not the only ones that can be involved. So this mentalizing system is also one that's heavily involved as well. So understanding how somebody else thinks or feels. Great question.
Have you looked at all at relationships with the work of Daniel Kahneman that won the Nobel Prize in economics a number of years ago? Fast versus slow thinking, system one, system two. I can sort of see relationships there with the first part of your presentation.
Yes, I am aware of some of that very important work. And definitely that's one sort of simple way of separating out different sorts of cognitive processes. I do think that it's a coarse-grained approximation, and that there are more complex dynamics as well. And I'm very interested in both the coarse graining and in the fine details as well. I think both are important.
Yeah, I think the results you showed early on about learning changes in structure with learning and predicting who would learn better are very interesting. At the same time, it seems like some of the explanations are very high level and sort of hand waving. So I'm just curious, like, how do you get at deeper mechanism in terms of neuronal dynamics and so on? Is there a way to do that from these types of results?
Yes, absolutely. There are. So I think that there are a couple ways to do that. One is to link them in animal models. Another way is to actually look at intra-module dynamics. So at the moment, we're looking at just the module dynamics themselves. But there's actually a lot of richness inside of each of those modules that then you can link specifically to basal ganglia function, to cerebellum, to other areas that have specific processes known to support motor learning. So absolutely. I did not get into those details, mostly because I thought that might not be the audience for it.
Hi, really enjoyed the talk. I had a question about the when you had the people learning the fractal images. I was wondering if there is a way of telling from your data apart the hypothesis that you presented, where they're learning the network structure, and maybe a simpler hypothesis where the participants are just learning a probability distribution over transitions between those images.
Yeah. Great
Yeah.
question. Yeah, so it has actually a flat transition probability landscape. So from each node, there are exactly 4 links, and each of them have a 25% chance of you passing on them. So that was a very specific nature of the experiment that enables us to say that it can't simply be about the transition probabilities because they're all equal. Does that make sense? Yeah, very good question. Sure.